In the days when Gil-galad yet held dominion over Lindon, and the shadow of Mordor lay quiescent beyond the Ephel-Duath, there came to Rivendell a wanderer, whose name was spoken in hushed tones among the wise. Thrandion the Grey, they called him, though his hair was black as the void between stars, and his eyes held depths that spoke of sorrows older than the Third Age. It was in the autumn of the year 1695 of the Second Age that Elrond first received word of this stranger's approach. The leaves of the valley were turning to gold and crimson when the messenger, a young elf lord named Erestor, brought tidings that would echo through the halls of time. "My lord," spoke Erestor, his voice trembling with an urgency seldom heard in the timeless realm of Rivendell, "there comes one who claims to bear knowledge of the Valar's own treasure halls. He speaks of theft most grievous, and of a doom that may yet fall upon all the children of Ilúvatar." Elrond set down the ancient tome he had been studying, its pages filled with the lore of the elder days. The firelight flickered across his noble features, casting shadows that seemed to dance with foreboding. "Bring him hence," commanded the Lord of Rivendell. "Let him speak his tale, though I fear what words may pass his lips." When Thrandion entered the Hall of Fire, a hush fell upon all who beheld him. Tall he was, and fair after the manner of the Noldor, yet about him clung an aura of shadow that made even the boldest of the Eldar step aside. His cloak was gray as storm clouds, and at his throat gleamed a pendant of mithril wrought in the shape of a star, but a star obscured, as though veiled by darkness. "Hail, Elrond Gil-galad's herald," spoke Thrandion, his voice like distant thunder. "I come bearing tidings that no ear should hear, yet must be spoken ere the music of creation itself be marred beyond all hope of repair." "Speak then," replied Elrond, though his heart was heavy with dread. "What knowledge do you bear that weighs so heavily upon your spirit?" Thrandion's eyes grew distant, as one who looks upon visions of far places and distant time. "In the halls of Mandot I dwelt for an age uncounted, after my Fea was severed from its housing of flesh in the last alliance. There, in the houses of the dead, I learned of a theft most terrible, a theft that shook the very foundations of Valinor itself." The assembled elves leaned forward in their seats, for the tale that Thrandion began to weave was unlike any they had heard, even in the long years of their dwelling in Middle-earth. "Know you all of the Silmarils of Feanor?" continued the Grey Wanderer. "Those jewels that held the light of the two trees, whose theft by Morgoth brought such woe upon the world. But hear now of another jewel, one whose making predates even the work of the greatest of the Noldor." A murmur ran through the hall, for this was lore unknown to even the wisest of Elrond's household. Glorfindel, who had walked in Gondolin in the elder days, stirred uneasily in his seat. "In the music of the Ainur," Thrandion spoke, his words falling like stones into still water. "There was a note that Eru Ilúvatar himself did sing, a note of such beauty and power that it took shape and form in the very halls of timeless. This note became a star, not a star of the heavens that you know, but a star of pure light and harmony, kept in the treasure vaults of Manwë himself." "The Erusilme," breathed Elrond, for this name came to him as though from the depths of memory itself. "The Star of Eru, but this is legend only, spoken of in the most ancient song." "Legend, say you?" Thrandion's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Nay, Lord of Rivendell, for I have seen it with mine own eyes, held it in my very hand, and I have done that which shall forever mark me as accursed among the children of light." The fire in the hearth seemed to dim at these words, and shadows gathered in the corners of the hall, like living things. Erestor moved closer to his lord, his hand instinctively moving to the hilt of his blade. "I stole the Erusilme from the halls of Manwë," declared Thrandion, his voice ringing with defiance and despair. "I, who was once counted among the wise and noble of Gondolin, became in that hour a thief beyond all measure of that word." "Impossible," whispered Glorfindel. "None may enter the halls of the Valar unbidden, save by the will of Eru himself." But Thrandion smiled, and in that smile was no warmth, only the cold light of stars reflected in winter ice. Ah, but there you mistake, noble Glorfindel, for there is one way, one path that even the Valar in their wisdom did not guard against, the path of the dead who refused to pass to their final rest. Through the night did Thrandion speak, and his tale grew ever more dark and terrible. He told of his death upon the slopes of the Dagorlad, pierced through the heart by a Nazgul's blade as the last alliance pressed toward the Black Gate. He spoke of his journey to the halls of Mandos, where the spirits of the slain elves awaited their time of renewal. "But I would not rest," said he, his eyes burning with an inner fire, "for in my dying moments I beheld a vision of Middle-earth consumed by darkness, of the peoples of the free folk enslaved to a will more terrible than Sauron's. I saw the music of creation itself corrupted, turned to discord and despair." "And what power showed you this vision?" asked Elrond, though he feared the answer. "One who walks in shadow, yet serves a purpose higher than the understanding of Valar or Maiar," replied Thrandion. "One who whispered to me of the Erusilme, and of how it alone might turn the tide of the coming darkness. For this star, born of Eru's own voice, holds within it the power to remake the music itself." The Lord of Rivendell felt a chill that had naught to do with the autumn air. "You speak of things that should not be. The music of the Aenir is the foundation of all that is. To alter it would be to risk the destruction of all creation." "Aye," finished Thrandion, "yet consider the alternative, to allow the shadow to grow until it consumes even the undying lands themselves. For this is what I beheld in my vision. Valinor burning, the two trees withered to ash, and Eru's own throne cracked and broken." Such words had never been spoken in the halls of Rivendell, and those who heard them felt as though the very foundations of their world had shifted beneath their feet. Glorfindel rose from his seat, his hand upon his sword. "This is blasphemy," he declared. "No power in all of Ea could threaten the halls of the Valar." "No power that they know of," corrected Thrandion. "But in the outer darkness, beyond the walls of night, there stir things that were old when the Ainur first took shape, and one of these ancient powers has turned its gaze upon our little realm." Through the remainder of the night did Thrandion speak of his journey from the halls of Mandos, telling how he had walked in spirit form through the shadows between worlds, following paths known only to the dead and the never-living. He spoke of the great gates of pearl and gold that guard the approaches to Valinor, and how he had passed them like smoke through water. "The Hall of Manwë stands upon the peak of Tanicatil," continued Thrandion, as the first light of dawn crept through the windows of Rivendell. "There, in a chamber wrought of crystal and starlight, lie the treasures of the King of the Valar. The Erusilme rested upon a pedestal of imperishable diamond, singing with a voice that harmonized with the very foundations of creation." He paused then, and those who watched saw that his hands trembled, as one who recalls a deed that shames him to his very core. To approach it was agony beyond description. The light of that star burned through my spirit form like flame through parchment, yet the voice that had spoken to me in vision whispered words of power, words that shielded me from the worst of the radiant. I reached out, and in a moment that seemed to last an age, I grasped the Erusilme. "What happened then?" asked Elrond, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thunder shook the foundations of Valinor. The very air sang with lamentations as the harmony of the Valar was broken. I fled then, bearing my stolen prize through the shadow roads, pursued by the wrath of the Guardians of the West. For 3 days and nights did they hunt me through the twilight realm between life and death, until at last I came to a place where even they dared not follow." "And where was this place?" pressed Glorfindel. Thrandian's smile was cold as winter moonlight. "The void itself, the empty darkness beyond all creation, where dwells he who was cast out before the beginning of time." At these words, several of the assembled elves cried out in horror and dismay, for all the Eldar knew the tale of Morgoth's casting into the void, and none spoke lightly of that terrible abyss. "You went unto Morgoth?" Elrond's voice was filled with such horror that even Thrandion flinched at the sound. "Nay," replied the Grey Wanderer, "for Morgoth lies bound in chains that shall not break until the end of day. But in the void there are other powers, older and stranger than even the rebel Vala. It was to one of these that I brought the Erusilmi, as I had been commanded in vision." "And what became of the star?" asked Erestor, though his voice shook with fear. "It was changed," said Thrandion slowly. "The power that dwelt in the void touched it, transforming its light from gold to silver, and from silver to something darker still. Yet its power remained, and perhaps grew stronger for the corruption. When the deed was done, I was sent back to Middle-earth, given flesh once more, but flesh marked by the shadows I had walked among." As the sun climbed higher over the valley of Rivendell, Thrandion reached within his cloak and drew forth an object that made all who beheld it gasp in wonder and terror. It was a star indeed, but a star transformed. Its light was not the pure radiance of the Silmarils, but something altogether more sinister. The light was black, if such a thing could be, a darkness that illuminated even as it consumed. "Behold, the Erusilme morn," spoke Thrandion, holding the corrupted star aloft, the star of Eru, transformed by shadow into something new, a key to unlock powers that the Valar in their wisdom have kept sealed since the foundation of the world. Elrond rose from his seat, his face pale with horror. "Put it away. The very sight of it tears at the fabric of harmony that holds this realm together." But Thrandion did not heed the Lord of Rivendell's word. Instead, he gazed upon the dark star with something approaching reverence. "Do you not understand? This is the weapon that shall turn back the coming shadow. For even now, in the forges of Mount Doom, Sauron labors to complete a work that shall enslave all free peoples. His ring of power grows near to completion, and when it is finished, no force in Middle-earth shall stand against him. Then let the Valar themselves intervene," declared Glorfindel, "as they did in the War of Wrath, when Morgoth was cast down. The Valar will not come again," said Thrandion with certainty that chilled all who heard it. "For in their halls they debate and counsel, and the span of their thoughts is vast. By the time they rouse themselves to action, all of Middle-earth shall lie in darkness. Only this," he held up the corrupted star, "holds the power to act swiftly enough to prevent that doom." Elrond stepped forward, his authority as Lord of Rivendell heavy in his voice. "I care not what visions drove you to this madness, Thrandion. You have committed a crime beyond measure, and brought into this realm an object of such corruption that its very presence defiles the air we breathe. Surrender it now, and perhaps the Valar in their mercy will find some way to undo what you have done." But Thrandion backed away, clutching the dark star to his breast. "You do not understand the nature of the enemy we face. Sauron is but a servant, a tool in the hands of powers that dwelt in darkness before the first light was kindled, and those powers have found a way to turn even the will of Eru against itself." "Speak plainly," commanded Elrond. "What do you mean?" "The ring that Sauron forges is not merely a device for ruling over the other rings of power," replied Thrandion. "It is a lens, a focusing crystal that shall channel the discord of the void itself into the heart of creation. When it is complete, it will not merely dominate the wills of men and elves, it will rewrite the music of the Ainur itself, turning harmony to chaos, light to darkness, hope to despair." Word of Thrandian's arrival and his dark tidings spread swiftly throughout Rivendell, and within 3 days there came to the valley other members of the White Council. Gandalf the Grey arrived first, his staff crackling with power and his eyes bright with urgency. With him came Radagast the Brown, who spoke little but watched Thrandion with the wary gaze of one who perceives corruption in the natural order. Saruman the White came last, resplendent in his robes of many colors, but his manner was troubled and his brow creased with deep thought. When all were assembled in the great hall, Elrond spoke thus: Fellow guardians of the free peoples, we face a crisis that may surpass even the darkest days of the Elder Days. This one who calls himself Thranduil claims to have stolen from the very halls of Manwë, and to bear a weapon that might turn back the shadow of Sauron. Yet the cost of his deed may be greater than any victory it might achieve. Gandalf stepped forward, his keen eyes fixed upon the corrupted star that Thranduil still held. "I sense in this thing a power that should not exist in Middle-earth," said the Grey Wizard. "Its very presence here creates ripples in the fabric of reality that reach even to the uttermost west." "Aye," agreed Saruman, though his voice held a note of fascination that troubled some who heard it. "Never before have I beheld an artifact that combines the creative power of Eru with the corrupting influence of the void. The knowledge that could be gained from studying such a thing is knowledge that no mortal mind should possess," interrupted Radagast firmly. "Even the trees and stones cry out at its presence. The very earth of this valley sickens beneath its shadow." Thranduil heard their words with growing anger, and when he spoke, his voice was like the hiss of a blade drawn from its sheath. "You speak as wise men, yet your wisdom is that of children who fear to touch fire, lest they be burned. While you debate and counsel, Sauron's work nears completion. Each day that passes brings us closer to a darkness that no force in Middle-earth can withstand." "Then tell us your plan," said Gandalf sternly. "How do you propose to use this thing to defeat the enemy?" Thranduil's eyes burned with fervor as he raised the dark star high. "The Erusilma morn holds within it the power to unmake that which should not be. When Sauron completes his ring and attempts to channel the discord of the void through it, I shall be there with this weapon. The two forces, creation corrupted and void given form, will cancel each other out, destroying both the ring and any who stand near it, including yourself," observed Elrond quietly. "A small price to pay for the salvation of all free peoples," replied Thranduil without hesitation, but Saruman's eyes had grown bright with a light that was not altogether wholesome. "There may be another way," said he slowly, "a way that does not require such final sacrifice." All eyes turned to Saruman as the White Wizard stepped forward, his staff gleaming with inner light. Upon his finger gleamed Narya, the red ring, one of the three great rings of the elves that had been entrusted to his keeping. "The power of this corrupted star is indeed great," said Saruman, his voice smooth as silk, "but it is uncontrolled, chaotic, dangerous beyond measure. What if it could be refined, purified, made into a tool for preserving rather than destroying?" Gandalf's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What do you propose, Saruman?" "I propose that we use the power of the three ring," replied the White Wizard. "Vilya, Narya, and Nenya, working in concert, might be able to cleanse the corruption from the Erusilme, while preserving its essential power. Think of it, a weapon of Eru's own making, free from the taint of the void, capable of standing against Sauron's ring on equal terms." Thranduil's grip tightened on the dark star, and for a moment it seemed he might refuse. But then a calculating light entered his eyes. "It is possible," he said slowly. "The power of the three rings is indeed great, and their purity is beyond question. But the risk is no greater than the risk of your own plan," finished Saruman, "and the potential rewards are far greater. With the Erusilma restored to its original purity, we could not merely defend against Sauron's assault. We could carry the battle to him, strike at the very heart of his power, in Mordor itself." Elrond looked deeply troubled by this proposal. As the bearer of Vilya, the mightiest of the three rings, he understood better than any the terrible risks involved in such an attempt. To use the three rings in such a manner would reveal their presence to Sauron, he warned. "The moment their power is unleashed on such a scale, he will know that we possess them." "He suspects already," said Saruman dismissively. "Better to use them now, while we still have the element of surprise, than to save them for a battle we may never have the chance to fight." But Gandalf shook his head firmly. "This plan is madness, Saruman. The corruption of the Erusilme runs too deep to be cleansed by any power of Middle-earth, and even if it could be purified, who among us has the right to wield such a weapon? It was made by Eru himself. What mortal hand should dare to grasp it? Then what do you propose? Demanded Thrandion, his patience wearing thin. That we sit here in comfort while the world burns? That we wait for the Valar to bestir themselves when all the free peoples lie in chains? It was then that Radagast, who had remained silent throughout the debate, spoke words that chilled all who heard them. "The trees have told me of a change in the wind," said the brown wizard quietly. "Something stirs in the east, beyond even the borders of Mordor. The very birds flee westward in terror, and the beasts of the wild seek shelter in the deepest places of the earth." The words of Radagast cast a pall of deeper fear over the assembly, for the brown wizard's connection to the natural world was stronger than any other among them. If the creatures of field and forest were fleeing westward, it spoke of a threat greater than any they had yet imagined. "What manner of threat lies in the east?" asked Elrond, though his heart was heavy with dread. "The trees speak of a darkness that moves," replied Radagast, his weathered face creased with worry. "Not the shadow of Mordor, which is static and bound to that land, but something that spreads like a plague across the earth. Cities fall before it without siege or battle. Their people simply cease." Thrandion's eyes widened with recognition and horror. "The unnamed fear," he whispered. "The power that showed me the vision, that commanded me to steal the Erusilme. It was not content to remain in the void. It has found a way to enter our world." "What is this unnamed fear?" demanded Gandalf, his staff blazing with light, as if to ward off the very mention of such evil. "One of the powers that dwelt in the void before creation began," replied Thrandion, his voice barely audible. "Older than Morgoth, older than the Ainur themselves. It is said that when Eru first sang the music of creation, these beings tried to sing discord in harmony with, seeking to corrupt the song from its very beginning. They were cast into the void for their presumption, but they have not ceased their hatred of all that is." Saruman's face had grown pale as he listened to these words. "If such a power has indeed entered Middle-earth, then all our plans and preparations are as dust before the wind. No force we can muster would stand against such." "Save one," said Thrandion grimly, raising the corrupted star. "The Erusilme morn was touched by the power of the void itself. It may be the only weapon that can stand against one of the unnamed." "Oh!" But even as he spoke these words, a tremor ran through the earth beneath Rivendell, and in the distance, the sound of horns could be heard. Not the fair horns of the Eldar, but something harsh and discordant that spoke of war and fire. Through the great windows of the hall, they could see smoke rising from the direction of the misty mountain. "It comes," breathed Radagast. "The trees cry out in anguish. The forests of Rovanion burn, and their burning is not natural fire, but something that devours even the memory of green growing things." Gandalf strode to the window, his face grim with resolve. "Then we have no more time for debate. Whatever action we take must be swift, for I fear that within days, perhaps hours, the enemy will be upon us." It was then that Thrandion made his fateful choice. Without warning, he raised the Erusilme morn high above his head, and its dark light blazed forth with such intensity that all in the hall were forced to shield their eyes. "I go now to face this ancient evil," he declared, his voice ringing with determination. "Let no one follow me, for the path I must walk leads into darkness from which there may be no return." But even as Thrandion spoke these words, the very walls of Rivendell began to shake, and through the fair valley there came a sound like the screaming of 10,000 voices in harmony. The light of the Erusilme morn flickered and dimmed as though something was drawing its power away. "The star is being called," gasped Thrandion, struggling to maintain his grip on the artifact. "The power that corrupted it seeks to reclaim what it has lost." Elrond's voice rang out above the growing tumult. "All who would preserve the free peoples must flee. This place can no longer shelter us from what comes." Through the halls of Rivendell ran the household of Elrond. gathering what treasures and lore could be saved before all was lost. Scrolls and books, wrought things of beauty and power, the memories of ages, all were hastily gathered, as the very foundations of the hidden valley began to crack and crumble. Glorfindel appeared at Elrond's side, his sword drawn and gleaming with elvish fire. "My lord, the horses are saddled, and the paths westward lie open. But if we flee, where shall we go? If Rivendell cannot stand against this evil, what refuge remains in Middle-earth?" "The Grey Havens," replied Elrond grimly. "We must reach the sea, and perhaps Círdan's ships can bear us to safety in the Undying Lands. It may be that only in Valinor itself can we find sanctuary from what pursues us." But Thrandion shook his head, his face set with grim resolve. "I will not flee. The Erusilme Morn was meant for this purpose, to stand against the powers of the void. Let me face this ancient evil here and now, and perhaps my sacrifice will buy time for others to escape." "You cannot stand alone against such a foe," declared Gandalf, his staff blazing with renewed light. "If you will not flee, then at least accept aid in your battle." "And mine as well," said Saruman, though there was something in his voice that spoke of motives beyond mere nobility. The power of the White Council united might yet prevail where single strength would fail. Yet, even as they spoke, the air itself seemed to darken, as though night was falling in the midst of day. Through the valley of Rivendell, there came a wind that carried with it the scent of ash and endings, and on that wind rode shapes that had no rightful place in the world of the living. The unnamed fear had come to Middle-earth, and with it rode the vanguard of powers that had dwelt in darkness since before the making of the world. Creatures of shadow and flame, beings of pure malice given form, spirits that fed on hope itself, all came pouring into the valley like a tide of destruction. The battle that followed was unlike any that had been fought in Middle-earth since the War of Wrath. Light clashed against darkness, order against chaos, creation against the void that sought to unmake all things. The very air crackled with power as the weapons of the White Council blazed forth against the oncoming tide of shadow. Gandalf's staff became a beacon of silver fire, cutting through the ranks of shadow creatures like a blade through smoke. Beside him, Saruman wielded forces that bent the very fabric of reality, turning the assault of the enemy back upon itself. Radagast called upon the power of all living things, and the very stones of Rivendell rose up to fight against the invaders. But at the center of the battle stood Thrandion, the Erusilme Morn, blazing in his hands with a light that was both terrible and beautiful to behold. Where its dark radiance fell, the creatures of the void shrieked and dissolved, their forms unable to maintain coherence in the presence of creation's own light, however corrupted. Yet for all their power, the defenders of Rivendell were being driven back. The forces of the unnamed fear seemed endless, pouring into the valley like a river of night. Worse yet, with each passing moment, the corrupted star in Thrandion's hands grew dimmer, its power being drained away by the very evil it sought to destroy. "The star fails!" cried Elrond, his own blade flickering with the light of Vilya as he cut down a creature of living shadow. "Whatever power animates these beings is stronger than the Erusilme can resist." It was then that Saruman made his move. With a gesture that spoke of long preparation, the White Wizard unleashed the full power of Narya, the Red Ring of Fire. But instead of directing its force against the enemy, he turned it upon the Erusilme Morn itself, seeking to cleanse the corruption from the star as he had proposed. The result was catastrophic. The moment the power of the Elven Ring touched the corrupted star, a reaction began that threatened to tear apart the very foundation of the world. Light and darkness, order and chaos, creation and void, all began to spiral together in a maelstrom of power that grew beyond any hope of control. "What have you done?" roared Gandalf. But his words were lost in the howling of forces unleashed beyond all measure. Thrandion, caught at the center of the magical storm, felt his very being begin to unravel. Yet in that moment of dissolution, he perceived at last the true nature of the trap that had been laid, the vision that had driven him to steal the Erusilmi, the voice that had whispered of salvation. All had been lies, designed to bring about this very moment. As the maelstrom of conflicting powers threatened to consume all of Rivendell, Thrandion fought to maintain his grip on consciousness long enough to speak a final warning. With his dying breath, he gasped out words that revealed the horrible truth behind all that had transpired. "Betrayer!" he cried, his eyes fixed upon Saruman. "It was you who spoke to me in the halls of Mando, you who showed me the false vision, you who sought to claim the star's power for yourself." The truth hit Gandalf like a physical blow. Saruman had not come to Rivendell to help defeat the enemy. He had orchestrated the entire crisis, using Thrandion as an unwitting tool to steal the Erusilme from the Valar themselves. The assault by the unnamed fear, the corruption of the star, even Thrandion's resurrection, all had been part of an elaborate plan to seize a power that no mortal should possess. "You understand at last," said Saruman, his voice filled with cold triumph. As he spoke, his form began to change, the white robes falling away to reveal armor of gleaming black metal. The fair face of the White Wizard twisted into something altogether more terrible, the countenance of one who had gazed too long into the darkness and been consumed by it. "For long years have I sought a way to surpass even Sauron in power," continued the transformed wizard. "The ring of power he forges in Mount Doom is a mighty thing, but it is limited, bound to the confines of Middle-earth, dependent upon the lesser rings for its strength. But the Erusilme, that is a prize worth any price, any betrayal." Gandalf raised his staff, but the power of the maelstrom made any attempt at resistance futile. "You have doomed us all, Saruman. The forces you have unleashed cannot be contained. They will consume not just Middle-earth, but all of creation itself." "Perhaps," admitted Saruman with terrible calm, "but better to rule over ashes to serve in paradise. And who knows, perhaps I shall find a way to reshape what remains according to my own design." Even as he spoke these words, the White Wizard began to draw the conflicting energies of the maelstrom into himself, his body becoming a conduit for powers that should have destroyed any mortal form. The corruption of the void, the creative force of Eru, the elemental might of the elven rings, all began to flow into Saruman, transforming him into something that was no longer entirely of Middle-earth. But the power was too great, too chaotic to be controlled even by one who had studied the secret ways of power for thousands of years. Cracks began to appear in Saruman's transformed form, and through those cracks leaked energies that threatened to tear holes in the very fabric of reality. In that moment of ultimate crisis, as the forces unleashed by Saruman's ambition threatened to consume all of Arda, an unexpected voice rang out across the chaos. It was Radagast who spoke, the humble brown wizard whose power had always been deemed the least among the Astari. "Enough!" cried Radagast, and with his words came the power of every living thing in Middle-earth. Every tree, every stone, every creature, great and small, lending their strength to his call. "You would unmake the music itself for the sake of power? Then let creation itself answer your presumption." Drawing upon forces older than the rings of power, older even than the Silmaril, Radagast began to weave a new song, not the grand music of the Ainur, but something smaller, more intimate. It was the song of growing things, of rain upon leaves, of roots deep in earth. It was the music of life itself, in all its countless form. The effect was immediate and profound. The chaotic energies that Saruman had sought to control began to stabilize, drawn into harmony by the Brown Wizard's song. The maelstrom slowed, then stopped, then began to reverse itself as order reasserted itself over chaos. But the cost was terrible. Radagast's mortal form could not contain such power for long, and even as he wove his song of salvation, his body began to fade, becoming one with the forces he commanded. Trees sprouted from his flesh, birds nested in his hair, and streams of clear water flowed from his eyes. "Remember," whispered Radagast as he dissolved into the elements he had spent his life protecting, The smallest song may yet turn back the greatest darkness, if it is sung with love rather than ambition. Saruman, robbed of the chaotic energies he had sought to control, found his transformed body reverting to its original form. But the power he had absorbed left its mark. His hair had turned from white to black. His robes were stained with ash, and in his eyes burned a light that spoke of madness. "This is not ended," snarled the fallen wizard as he gathered his remaining strength. "I shall find another way, another path to the power I seek. You have won this battle, but the war between order and ambition has only just begun." With these words, Saruman vanished in a whirl of shadow and smoke, leaving behind only the scent of burning metal and the echo of terrible laughter. As the dust settled over the ruins of Rivendell, the surviving members of the White Council stood amid the devastation and contemplated what had been lost and what had been saved. The Erusilma morn lay shattered upon the ground, its corrupted light finally extinguished. The valley itself was scarred beyond recognition, its ancient beauty marred by the forces that had been unleashed within its borders. Yet hope remained. The immediate threat had been turned aside, and though Saruman had escaped to plot anew, his first great gambit for power had failed. The free peoples still stood, still fought, still sang their songs of defiance against the darkness. And in the west, beyond the shores of Middle-earth, the Valar at last began to stir, for the theft of the Erusilma had not gone unnoticed. Ships began to sail from Valinor, bearing aid to those who had stood against the shadow. But that, as they say, is a tale for another day. Thus ended the first great crisis of the Second Age, when he who stole from the Valar learned too late that some prices are too high to pay, and some powers too dangerous to wield. The theft of the Erusilmi had indeed set great events in motion, but not as Thranduil or his manipulator had intended. In seeking to grasp the music of creation itself, they had only proved that some melodies are meant to be heard, not sung by mortal voices. And in the ruins of Rivendell, where Radagast had made his final sacrifice, there grew a garden more beautiful than any that had existed before, a testament to the truth that life and hope, however small, will always find a way to triumph over the forces that seek to unmake them. Epilogue: The Gardens of Memory. In the days that followed the great battle at Rivendell, when the dust of ages had settled upon the scarred stones of that once fair valley, there came a time of reckoning among the wise. The sun rose and set 7 times over the ruin before the first of the great lords dared to speak of what had transpired, for the weight of Radagast's sacrifice lay heavy upon all who had witnessed it, and the betrayal of Saruman cut deeper than any blade forged in the fires of Mount Doom. Elrond stood among the broken fountains where once the music of clear water had sung in harmony with elvish voices. His hair, once dark as the night sky, had become streaked with silver in the span of those 7 days, as though the corruption that had touched the Erusilma had aged him beyond the count of years. In his hands he held the fragments of ancient scrolls, their parchment blackened and crumbling, yet still bearing traces of the wisdom they had once contained. "What now? Gil-galad's herald!" came a voice from behind him, and turning, Elrond beheld Círdan the shipwright, who had come from the Grey Haven upon hearing word of the devastation. The ancient elf lord's eyes were bright with tears unshed, for he had loved the Valley of Rivendell as a place where the music of Valinor still echoed faintly in the running water and rustling leaves. "Now we build anew," replied Elrond, though his voice carried little hope. "Yet, what foundation shall we lay? The very stones of this place have been touched by powers that should never have walked in Middle-earth. Can aught that grows here ever again be free from the shadow of what was done?" Círdan approached the ruins of the great library, where tomes of lore gathered over countless ages lay scattered like autumn leaves. "Perhaps that is not for us to decide," said he thoughtfully. "In Valinor, when the 2 trees were destroyed by Morgoth's malice, yet from their last light came the Silmarils, and from the Silmarils came hope for all the peoples of Middle-earth. Mayhap from this destruction also shall come something fair though we may not live to see its flowering." Even as the shipwright spoke these words, there came the sound of footsteps upon the broken paths of Rivendell, and the two elf lords turned to see Gandalf approaching. The Grey Wizard leaned heavily upon his staff, and his robes were torn and stained with the ash of battle. Yet his eyes burned still with the inner fire that had made him a terror to the servants of darkness in all the long years of his watching. "I bring word from the uttermost west," said Gandalf without preamble. "The Valar have felt the theft of the Erusilmi as a wound in their very being. Even now, their messengers cross the sundering seas, and their judgment shall soon fall upon all who had part in these deeds." Elrond felt a chill that had naught to do with the autumn wind. "Their judgment? What manner of doom do they bring?" "That I know not," replied Gandalf. "Yet I fear it shall be terrible, for never before in all the ages of the world has one dared to steal from the treasure halls of Manwë himself. The very foundation of the order between Valar and the children of Ilúvatar have been shaken by this deed." As if summoned by the wizard's word, there came then a great wind from the west, bearing with it the scent of malorn flowers and the distant sound of silver trumpet. The sky, which had been gray with smoke and ash, began to clear, and through the parting clouds there shone a light that was not of the sun nor moon, but something altogether more fair and terrible. "They come," whispered Círdan, and his voice held both reverence and fear. "After long ages of silence, the guardians of the West wake and walk again upon Middle-earth. From the western sky they came, riding upon the wings of the great eagles of Manwë, their forms clothed in light that made the very air shimmer like water disturbed by falling stone. 5 there were in number, and each bore the aspect of powers that had walked in the blessed realm since before the making of the two trees. Foremost among them rode one whose name was spoken in whispers, even in Valinor, Eönwë the Herald, mightiest of all the Maiar save Melian only. His armor was wrought of imperishable starlight, and in his hand he bore a sword that sang with the music of the sphere. Behind him came 4 others of his kindred, each terrible in beauty and mighty in power beyond the understanding of mortal mind. When their feet touched the earth of Rivendell, the very stones cried out in recognition of their presence, and what remained of the ancient fountains began once more to flow with water, clear as crystal. Yet the light that emanated from the Maiar was not the warm radiance of the sun, but something colder, more remote, the light of justice unmarred by mercy. Eönwë spoke, and his voice was like the sound of great bells ringing across vast distance. "Children of Ilúvatar, we come in the name of Manwë Sulimo, King of Arda, to seek account for deeds done in defiance of the Muse. Where is he who calls himself Thrandion, who dared to walk the shadow roads into the very halls of the Lord of..." Elrond stepped forward, though his heart quailed at the terrible majesty of the herald. "He is dead, Great One, consumed by the very corruption he sought to wield against the enemy. Yet before his end, he spoke words that revealed the true architect of this evil." "Speak," commanded Eönwë, and though he uttered but one word, the power in it compelled truth from all who heard it. Thus did Elrond tell the full tale of Saruman's deception, sparing nothing of the White Wizard's manipulation of Thrandion's noble intent. He spoke of the false vision, the corruption of the Erusilmi, and the final betrayal that had nearly torn asunder the very fabric of creation. When at last he fell silent, the herald stood in thought for long moments, his face grave with the weight of judgment. "Where now is this Saruman of many colors?" asked Eönwë at length. "Fled," replied Gandalf. "He has taken on the aspect of shadow and flame, and walks now in hidden places, nursing his wounded pride and plotting new mischief. Yet the power he sought to claim was denied him, and he is diminished from what he was." Eönwë nodded slowly. "Then he shall be found in due time, for no shadow is deep enough to hide from the gaze of the Valar when their wrath is kindled. Yet there remains the matter of the theft itself, and the corruption that was wrought upon the Erusilmi. From within his armor of light, the herald drew forth an object that made all who beheld it cry out in wonder and dismay. It was a star indeed, but not the corrupted thing that Thrandion had borne. This was the Erusilmi, as it had been made in the music of the Ainur, pure, radiant, filled with the very voice of Eru Ilúvatar himself. "Behold," said Eönwë, "the star of Eru, stolen from the halls of Manwë, and corrupted by the touch of the void. Yet corruption cannot endure when faced with the source of its own making. The false star that brought such woe has been unmade, and in its place the true Erusilma has been restored." Yet even as relief began to dawn in the hearts of those who watched, the herald's expression grew stern once more. "But the theft remains, and the order of the world has been disturbed. A price must be paid, lest others be tempted to similar folly." The judgment of Eönwë fell not upon those who had fought against the corruption, but upon the very land of Middle-earth itself. For the herald decreed that never again should such a theft be possible, and to ensure this, he wove about all the realm a great ward, a barrier of power that would prevent any from walking the shadow roads to the blessed realm. "Henceforth," declared Eönwë, "the paths between the circles of the world and the undying lands shall be barred to all save those who pass by the grace of the Valar. No longer shall the spirits of the dead find easy passage to the halls of Mando, save by the straight road alone, and even that road shall be hedged about with perils for any who would walk it with evil intent." The implications of this judgment struck the assembled wise like a blow. For countless ages, the boundary between life and death had been permeable to those with knowledge and power. The spirits of the slain elves had always found their way to the halls of waiting, there to abide until their time of renewal came. Now that easy passage was barred, and death would become a more final thing for all the peoples of Middle-earth. "But what of our kindred who fall in battle?" asked Círdan, his voice filled with anguish. "What of those who long for the peace of Valinor? Are they to be denied the comfort of the undying lands?" "Not denied," replied Eönwë, "but the path shall be harder, the journey more perilous. Only those whose hearts are pure and whose purpose is untainted by shadow shall find their way to the Grey Haven and thence to the Blessed Realm. It is a harsh judgment, yet necessary, for the alternative is the corruption of Valinor itself." As the herald spoke these words, there came a great rumbling from beneath the earth, and the very foundations of Middle-earth seemed to shift and settle into new patterns. Mountains rose higher, valleys sank deeper, and the paths between the realms grew dark and treacherous. The wound that Thrandions theft had made in the order of creation was being sealed, but at a cost that would be felt by all the children of Ilúvatar for ages to come. Yet even as this great working was accomplished, another wonder began to manifest in the ruins of Rivendell, where Radagast had made his final sacrifice, offering his life to restore harmony to the chaotic forces that Saruman had unleashed. There began to grow a garden unlike any that had existed since the Elder Days. The first shoots appeared even as Eönwë spoke his judgment, tender green stems pushing up through the blackened earth, carrying within them a vitality that seemed to mock the very concept of death. The trees that grew from these shoots bore leaves of silver and gold, and their fruit was fair to look upon, though none dared taste of it, for it was clear that this was no ordinary growing thing. "What grows here?" asked Gandalf, his voice filled with wonder as he beheld the miraculous garden taking shape before their eyes. Eönwë turned his terrible gaze upon the sprouting plants, and for the first time since his arrival, something like a smile touched his lips. "This is the price of noble sacrifice," said he. "Radagast the Brown gave his life to preserve the harmony of creation, and from his sacrifice springs something new, a garden that shall serve as a bridge between the natural world and the realm of spirit." As they watched, the garden continued to grow with supernatural speed. Flowers bloomed that seemed to capture starlight in their petals, and vines spread that hummed with melodies too fair for mortal ears to fully comprehend. At the center of it all grew a tree greater than all the rest, a malern of such size and beauty that it rivaled the great trees of Lothlorien. "This tree shall be called Radagastinion," declared Eonwa, "the tree of the Brown One, and it shall serve as a memorial to all who sacrifice themselves for the greater good. Its fruit shall have the power to heal wounds of both body and spirit, and its leaves, when they fall, shall carry with them the dreams of peaceful sleep." In the days that followed the departure of Eonwe and his company, when the echo of their passing had faded from the air, and the new ward they had woven settled into the fabric of Middle-earth, there came a time of choosing for those who remained in the ruins of Rivendell. The valley could be restored, of that there was no doubt. The growing power of Radagastinion saw to that. Yet the question remained, who would dwell there, and what purpose would they serve? Elrond stood beneath the great Malorn, its silver leaves rustling with a sound like distant music, and contemplated the burden that had fallen upon him. As bearer of Vilya, mightiest of the three rings, he had been charged with preserving the wisdom and beauty of the elder days. Yet now that charge had taken on new meaning, for with the shadow roads barred and the path to Valinor grown treacherous, Middle-earth had become more isolated than ever before. "I will remain," he said at last, his words carrying across the garden to where Gandalf and Círdan stood in quiet conversation. "This place has been sanctified by sacrifice and blessed by the power of the Valar themselves. Here shall be gathered the lore of ages past, and here shall be trained those who will guard against future threats." Gandalf nodded approvingly. "It is well, yet you cannot bear this burden alone. The treachery of Saruman has shown us that even the wise may fall to corruption when they walk in isolation. There must be others to share the watch, others to provide counsel when the shadows grow long." It was then that there came an unexpected voice from the edges of the garden. "Perhaps I might offer my service in this matter." Turning, they beheld a figure approaching through the twilight, an elf lord of noble bearing, his hair dark as midnight and his eyes gray as the sea in storm. He walked with the measured pace of one who had traveled far, and upon his brow gleamed a circlet of mithril set with a single gem that caught and reflected the light of the Malorn's leave. "I am Gil-galad," said the newcomer, and at these words the assembled wise felt their hearts leap with joy and wonder. For Gil-galad, the elven king had fallen at the siege of Barad-dûr in the last alliance, and his death had been mourned throughout all the realms of the free people. "But you are dead," breathed Elrond. "I saw you fall upon the slopes of Mount Doom, saw your light fade from the world." Gil-galad smiled, and in that smile was all the warmth of summer returning after a long winter. "Dead I was indeed, and long did my spirit abide in the halls of Mandos. Yet when the theft of the Erusilme was discovered, and the Valar learned of the great deception that had been practiced upon Middle-earth, they deemed it fitting that one who had died fighting the darkness should return to stand guard against its resurgence. The returned king approached the Malorn tree and placed his hand upon its trunk, and at his touch, the tree seemed to thrum with renewed power. "I am sent to be the guardian of this place, to ensure that the wisdom gathered here is used only for good, and that never again shall corruption take root among those sworn to protect the free peoples." Gandalf leaned heavily upon his staff, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Welcome back, great king. Your return brings hope to hearts that had grown heavy with despair. Yet tell us, what news do you bring from the undying land? How fare the Valar in the aftermath of these dark deeds?" "They are wrathful," replied Gil-galad without hesitation. "The theft of the Erusilme has awakened them from the long contemplation that has held them since the end of the elder days. No longer will they be content to watch from afar, while evil spreads its tendrils through Middle-earth. Even now, they prepare measures to ensure that such deception cannot again threaten the order of creation." The king's expression grew grave as he continued, "Yet their wrath is tempered by wisdom, and they have seen fit to send aid rather than judgment. I am but the first of several who shall return from the halls of the dead to take up the watch once more. Others will follow. Some you know, some you have only heard of in song and story." As if summoned by his words, There came then the sound of footsteps upon the garden paths, and from among the silver trees emerged another figure, this one bearing the aspect of one of the Dunedain, tall and stern, with eyes gray as winter sky. Upon his breast gleamed the Elisar, the elf stone that had once belonged to the kings of Arnor. "Isildur," whispered Elrond, and in that name was both joy and old grief, for Isildur had been both hero and the source of great sorrow. The returned king of Gondor bowed deeply to the assembled company. "I am come to make amends for the failure that has shadowed my name through all the ages since the last alliance. The one ring that I failed to destroy has worked its evil upon the world for long centuries, and though it is not yet wrought to its full power, its influence grows stronger with each passing year." Gil-galad placed a hand upon Isildur's shoulder, a gesture of forgiveness and brotherhood. "The past is past, kinsman. You are here now, and that is what matters. Together, we shall ensure that the mistakes of our time are not repeated in the ages to come." In the great hall that grew beneath the boughs of Radagastinion, its walls formed of living wood and its roof of interwoven branches, there assembled a council unlike any that had met since the end of the First Age. Gil-galad took his place at the head of the gathering, the light of the Elven King's crown casting silver shadows upon the walls. To his right sat Elrond, bearer of Vilya and lord of what remained of Rivendell. To his left sat Isildur, returned from death to atone for his ancient failing. Around the council table, wrought of a single great branch that had grown in the shape of a perfect circle, took their places others who had answered the call of the Valar. There was Glorfindel, who had died in Gondolin and been granted life again to fight the Witch King of Angmar. There was Elladan and Elrohir, the sons of Elrond, who bore now a wisdom beyond their apparent years. And there were others, elves and men, who had proven themselves in life and been deemed worthy of return. Yet one chair remained empty, and all who looked upon it felt a shadow upon their hearts, for it was the seat that should have been occupied by Radagast the Brown, whose sacrifice had made this gathering possible. "Let us speak plainly," said Gil-galad, when all had taken their places. "The corruption of Saruman has shown us that even the Istari, those sent by the Valar themselves to guide and protect, may fall to the lure of power. We cannot assume that wisdom and good intent are sufficient guards against the subtle corruption of evil." Gandalf, who sat among the council though he had not died and returned, shifted uneasily at these words. "You speak truly, great king, yet if even the Maiar may fall, what hope have we lesser beings to stand against such temptation?" "The hope that lies in fellowship," replied Elrond. "Saruman fell because he walked alone in his pride, believing himself above the counsel of others. We must ensure that none among us bears such burdens in isolation." Isildur leaned forward, his hands clasped before him on the table of living wood. "There is wisdom in these words, yet I fear we face a threat greater than the corruption of individuals. The theft of the Erusilme has shown that there are powers at work in the world, powers older and more terrible than Sauron himself. The unnamed fear," whispered Elladan, and his brother Elrohir nodded grimly. "Aye," said Gil-galad, "in the halls of Mandos, I learned much of this ancient evil. It is one of the powers that existed before the music of the Ainur, a force of pure entropy that seeks to return all creation to the void from whence it came. Morgoth himself was but a servant of such powers, though he knew it not. The revelation struck the council like a physical blow. That Morgoth, mightiest of the Ainur save Manwë alone, had been merely a tool in the hands of something greater was a thought too terrible to fully comprehend. "If this is so," said Glorfindel slowly, "then our preparations must be all the greater, for we face not merely the evil of one Dark Lord, but the inexorable pull of entropy itself. Yet we are not without weapons," declared Gil-galad. "The sacrifice of Radagast has shown us the power that lies in willing self-sacrifice for the greater good. The garden that grows around us is proof that life and growth can triumph over decay and dissolution. if the price is willingly paid. As if in response to the king's words, the great Malorn began to sing, not with any voice that mortal ears could fully comprehend, but with a melody that spoke directly to the spirits of those who heard it. It was a song of defiance, of life asserting itself against the void, of hope kindled in the darkest hour. "Then let us make our plans," said Elrond, his voice filled with new resolve. "Let us prepare for the battles to come, and let us ensure that when the time of greatest trial arrives, we shall not be found wanting." In the months that followed the formation of the Council of the Returned, the Valley of Rivendell was transformed beyond all recognition. Where once had stood the familiar halls and libraries of Elrond's house, there now grew a living citadel, its walls formed of trees that bent their branches in intricate pattern, its towers rising like great trunks toward the sky. The Malorn Radagastinion stood at the heart of it all, its roots spreading deep into the earth and its branches reaching high into the heavens. From its fruit came healing for those who were wounded in body or spirit, and from its leaves, when they fell in their appointed season, came dreams of peace to those who slept beneath its boughs. Yet the greatest wonder of the new Rivendell lay not in its physical transformation, but in the gathering of knowledge and wisdom that took place within its living halls. From across all Middle-earth came those who bore fragments of ancient lore, seeking to preserve their treasures in the sanctuary that the Valar themselves had blessed. Tom Bombadil came from the Old Forest, bearing songs that predated even the awakening of the elves. The Entwives, long thought lost, emerged from hidden valleys to share the secrets of growing things that they had preserved through all the ages of their exile. Even some of the dwarves, putting aside their ancient grudge against the Eldar, came to offer the stone lore they had learned in the deeps of the earth. All this knowledge was gathered and preserved in the Library of Living Memory, where the very walls were formed of trees whose bark bore the inscriptions of countless scribes and whose leaves whispered with the voices of those who had contributed to the great collection. Here were stored not only books and scrolls, but the songs, stories, and traditions of all the free peoples of Middle-earth. Gil-galad walked often among these halls of knowledge, marveling at the breadth of wisdom that had been assembled. Yet his heart was troubled, for he knew that knowledge alone would not be sufficient to face the trials that lay ahead. There must also be guardians, not merely protectors of the wisdom, but champions who could bear it forth into the world when the need arose. It was for this purpose that the king established the Order of the Silver Tree, taking as their symbol the Malorn Radagastinion, and swearing themselves to the protection of all life against the forces of entropy and decay. The first members of this order were drawn from among the returned dead, those who had already proven their devotion by laying down their lives in service to the greater good. Yet the order was not limited to those who had died and returned. Living elves, men, and even some dwarves and hobbits were invited to join, provided they could demonstrate both wisdom and courage in equal measure. Each member was given a pendant wrought in the shape of a silver tree, and each swore an oath that bound them not merely to the defense of Middle-earth, but to the preservation of the music of creation itself. The training of these guardians was overseen by Isildur, who had been granted new understanding of the burden of leadership through his time in the halls of Mandos. Under his guidance, the members of the Order learned not only the arts of war, but the more subtle skills of recognizing and resisting corruption in all its forms. "Remember," Isildur would tell his students as they practiced their exercises in the shadow of the great Malorn, "the greatest enemies we face are not orcs or trolls or even dragons. They are pride, fear, and despair, the shadows that grow within our own hearts when we lose sight of what we fight to protect." Yet even as hope grew strong in the renewed Rivendell, dark tidings came from the eastern land. The unnamed fear that had been stirred to wakefulness by Thranduil's theft of the Erusilme had not returned to its slumber. Instead, it moved like a plague across the far reaches of Middle-earth, consuming not merely the bodies of those it encountered, but their very essence, their capacity for hope, love, and joy. The first reports came from traders who had ventured beyond the Sea of Rune, seeking new markets for their goods. They spoke of empty cities where no sign of battle could be found, yet where all life had simply ceased. Not death as mortals understood it, but something far worse. An absence so complete that even the memory of life seemed to fade from the very stones. As these reports multiplied, Gil-galad called together the Council of the Returned to consider their response. The great hall beneath Radagastinion filled once more with those who had been granted return from death, their faces grave with the knowledge of what they faced. "The enemy moves with purpose," reported Elladan, who had led a company of scouts to the borders of the afflicted region. "It does not seek conquest in any sense we understand, but rather unmaking. Where it passes, not merely life, but the very potential for life is extinguished." Elrohir nodded grimly. "We encountered refugees fleeing westward, men, women, and children, who spoke of a darkness that consumed not only their homes, but their very memories of happiness. Many had forgotten the faces of loved ones, the taste of food, the warmth of sunlight. They fled not from death, but from an existence so hollow that death would have been a mercy." Gandalf, his face drawn with worry, leaned heavily upon his staff. "This is the true nature of the unnamed fear, not destruction, but negation. It seeks to return all of creation to the void that existed before the music of the Ainur, to unmake not just what is, but whatever was or could be. Then we must act swiftly," declared Gil-galad, "for if this corruption spreads unchecked, it will eventually reach even these blessed shores, and not even the protection of the Valar will avail us." Yet even as the king spoke these words, Isildur raised a hand for silence. His face was pale, and his eyes held the distant look of one who perceives visions beyond the sight of mortal eyes. "Too late," he whispered. "It is already here." As if summoned by his words, a great wind arose, carrying with it the scent of ending, not the clean smell of autumn leaves or winter snow, but something far more terrible. It was the scent of hope itself dying, of joy curdling into despair, of love transforming into indifference. The members of the council rose to their feet, their hands moving instinctively to their weapons, yet they knew that no blade could stand against what approached. For this was not an enemy that could be fought with sword or spear, but something that attacked the very foundations of existence itself. Outside the great hall, they could hear the sound of the Malorn's leaves rustling with increasing agitation, and the song that had always emanated from its branches began to change, becoming discordant and strained. The corruption was beginning to touch even Radagastinion, the tree that had grown from the sacrifice of the Brown Wizard. "To the tree!" commanded Gil-galad, and the council members rushed from the hall into the garden beyond. What they saw there filled their hearts with horror, for the silver leaves of the great Malorn were beginning to dim, their radiance fading like stars going out one by one. Yet it was not the corruption of the tree that struck fear into their hearts, but what stood at its base. There, wreathed in shadows that seemed to devour light itself, stood a figure that might once have been Saruman. Yet what had returned was no longer recognizably the White Wizard who had betrayed them. This thing was entropy, given form, negation clothed in the semblance of flesh. "Behold," spoke the creature that had once been Saruman, its voice like the sound of 1,000 hopes dying. "The futility of your endeavors. You seek to preserve what cannot be preserved, to maintain what must inevitably decay. I offer you the peace of ending, the rest that comes when all struggles cease." Gil-galad stepped forward, the light of his crown blazing forth to ward off the encroaching darkness. "You offer nothing but the void, fallen one. We choose the struggle, even knowing it must end, for in the struggle itself lies the meaning you would steal from us." The creature laughed, and its laughter was like the sound of ice cracking in the depths of winter. "Meaning? What meaning can there be in a song that must eventually end? What purpose in a light that must inevitably be extinguished? I show you the truth that the Valar would hide. All things pass, all things fade, all things return to the darkness from whence they came. Yet they pass, having been," replied Elrond, stepping to stand beside his king. The song ends, but it was sung. The light fades, but it shone. In their passing, they leave traces, echoes of beauty that enrich the music even in their absence. Then let me show you how even echoes can be silenced, hissed the creature, and it raised its hands toward the great Malorn. Dark tendrils of nothingness flowed from its fingers, reaching out to wrap around the trunk of Radagastinion. Where the tendrils touched, the bark began to wither and crack, and the song of the tree grew ever more discordant. The members of the Order of the Silver Tree cried out in anguish, for they could feel the corruption spreading through their spiritual link to the Malorn. Yet in that moment of greatest despair, an unexpected voice rang out across the garden, clear and strong, and filled with a joy that even the presence of entropy could not diminish. "No," said the voice, and turning, the assembled guardians beheld a sight that filled their hearts with wonder. Standing among the silver trees of the garden was Radagast the Brown, not as they had known him in life, but transformed, made one with the growing things he had spent his existence protecting. The returned wizard was no longer merely a being of flesh and blood, but something greater, a spirit of life itself, clothed in the verdant power of all growing thing. His hair was formed of trailing vine, his robes of living moss, and in his eyes burned the light of every star that had ever guided a seedling toward the sun. "I chose sacrifice over safety," declared Radagast, his voice harmonizing with the song of the Malorn, "hope over despair, life over the void. And in that choice, I found something you can never understand, the knowledge that some things are more important than their own preservation." What followed was not a battle in any sense that mortal minds could comprehend, but rather a contest between two fundamental aspects of existence, creation and entropy, being and non-being, the song and the silence that would consume it. Radagast raised his hands, and from his touch flowed the power of every living thing that had ever drawn breath beneath the sun. The great Malorn responded to his call, its branches reaching higher toward the sky, its roots digging deeper into the earth. The corruption that had begun to spread through its bark was met and held, then slowly pushed back by the force of life, asserting itself against dissolution. Yet the creature that had been Saruman was not so easily defeated. Drawing upon powers older than Middle-earth itself, it summoned forth the unnamed fear in all its terrible glory. The very air began to thin, as though existence itself was being drained away. Stars dimmed in the sky, and the moon grew pale and wan. In that moment of ultimate crisis, when it seemed that the void might indeed triumph over all that was fair and good in the world, Gil-galad made a choice that would echo through all the ages to come. Placing his hand upon the hilt of his sword, not the blade he had borne in life, but a weapon forged in the halls of Mandos, from the grief of all who mourned the corruption of beauty, he spoke words of power that had been taught to him by the Valar themselves. "By the light of Erendil's star," he declared, "by the music of the Ainur, by the sacrifice of all who have given their lives that others might live in hope, I name you, creature of the void. You are unbeing, negation, the eater of song, and by those names I bind you." The effect was immediate and terrible. The creature shrieked as the names took hold, for to name a thing truly is to have power over it, and Gil-galad spoke with the authority of one who had walked in death and returned to tell the tale. The shadows that wreathed the fallen Saruman began to writhe and twist, no longer under his control. "Now!" cried Radagast, and the great Malorn sang forth with such power that the very foundations of the earth trembled. Yet this was not the song of entropy and decay, but something far different, the song of renewal, of spring following winter, of hope kindled anew in the darkest hour. Every member of the Order of the Silver Tree joined their voices to that cosmic melody, and their song was taken up by the trees of the garden, by the stones of the earth, by the very air itself. From across Middle-earth came the response, eagles crying from their mountain peaks, ents groaning in their ancient woods, even the stones of the mountains humming with harmonies too deep for mortal ears to hear. The creature fought against the binding of names and the power of the renewed song, but its strength was that of negation. and negation cannot stand against affirmation. Slowly, inexorably, the shadows began to dissipate, and the form that had once been Saruman started to fade. "This is not the end," it hissed, as its substance scattered like smoke before wind. "The void is patient, and entropy is the destiny of all things. What you have won here is but a moment's respite in an eternal night." "Then we shall make that moment count," replied Gil-galad firmly. "For in the end, moments are all we have, and in each moment lies the choice between despair and hope, between surrender and defiance." With a final shriek that echoed across all the realms of Middle-earth, the creature dissolved entirely, leaving behind only the faint scent of ashes and the memory of darkness glimpsed.